For 1,000 years, three nations told the same story: Ireland, Scotland, England. Separate peoples, separate blood, separate histories. They built walls between themselves. They fought wars. They drew borders on maps and called those borders permanent. They were wrong. In 2023, scientists ran the largest genetic study ever conducted on the British Isles. They didn't find three peoples. They didn't even find two. What they found shocked everyone, because buried inside the DNA of millions of living people was a secret that no border, no war, no king had ever managed to erase. A truth older than England itself. So what really happened? Let's start with what everyone believes. Ask anyone on the street, in Dublin, in Edinburgh, in London, and they'll give you the same answer. The Irish are Celtic, ancient, island people who held on to their identity through centuries of invasion and famine and hardship. Their roots, they'll tell you, go back thousands of years, untouched, unbroken. The Scottish are warriors, Highlanders, a fierce, separate people who painted their faces blue and held back the Roman Empire with sheer will. Their blood is their own. The English? Norman, Anglo-Saxon. Germanic stock that crossed the Channel and remade an island in their image. Three peoples, three stories, clean, simple, settled, except none of it is quite true. And the scientists who spent years mapping the genetic landscape of these islands knew it. They had suspected something was wrong with the official story for decades. Small studies kept throwing up strange results. Anomalies that didn't fit the textbooks. Genetic signals that crossed borders they weren't supposed to cross. But the data was always too thin, the sample sizes too small. The technology not quite sharp enough to see what was really there. Then everything changed. A project launched, bigger than anything before it. Hundreds of thousands of DNA samples, ancient bones, living descendants. A genetic map of the British Isles drawn not with ink, but with chromosomes. And when the results came in, clean, simple story collapsed, but the real story was buried much deeper. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture Britain, not modern Britain, not the Britain of motorways and tower blocks and football stadiums. Picture it 6,000 years ago. Dotis forest covering everything, rivers cutting through chalk and limestone. A landscape so wild it barely resembles the island people know today. And moving through that landscape, people. We don't know their names. We don't know their language. We call them, simply, the early European farmers. They arrived from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, around 4000 BC. They crossed through Europe slowly, farming as they went, clearing forests, building monuments. They built Stonehenge. Let that land for a moment. The people most associated with ancient Britain, the ones who hauled those massive stones across impossible distances, were not originally from Britain at all. They came from the edge of the Middle East. And they thrived here. For over 1,000 years, they were the dominant population of these islands. Then something changed. Around 2500 BC, a new group arrived. Archaeologists call them the Bell Beaker people. They came from the Pontic Steppe, the vast grasslands stretching across modern Russia and Ukraine. They were herders, metalworkers, and they carried something with them that would reshape these islands completely. A new genetic lineage. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Within a few generations, the early European farmers were almost entirely replaced. Not conquered in any simple sense. Not wiped out by war alone, but absorbed, displaced, outnumbered, until their DNA almost vanished from the archaeological record. Almost, because here is where it gets strange. The replacement wasn't equal across all three regions. In England, the Beaker people flooded in. Their genetic signal is overwhelming in ancient English samples. In Ireland and Scotland, the replacement was slower, patchier, less complete, meaning the people of Ireland and Scotland today carry more of that original Anatolian farmer DNA than the English do. The Irish, who pride themselves on ancient Celtic roots, are in fact genetically closer to Stone Age farmers from Turkey than they are to the Celts they celebrate. No one expected what came next. Because when scientists looked deeper, When they started cross-referencing the ancient DNA with modern samples, they found something that made the border between Ireland, Scotland, and England look almost meaningless. Not politically, not culturally, genetically. The first serious alarm bell rang in the early 2000s. A geneticist named Brian Sykes at Oxford University was studying maternal lineages. DNA passed through the mother's line. Across Europe, he found something unexpected. When he mapped the genetic clusters of people living in the British Isles, the borders didn't line up at all. The genetic boundary between England and Scotland sat in a completely different place than the political border. The genetic overlap between the west coast of Scotland and the north of Ireland was so strong it was almost impossible to separate them. And the English, supposed descendants of Anglo-Saxon invaders, were carrying far more ancient British DNA than anyone had predicted. The records showed distinct regional populations. But one detail didn't fit. The people were not where history said they should be. Sykes published. The academic world took note. And then, slowly, other researchers started pulling at the same threads. A team in Dublin began looking at ancient Irish genomes, DNA extracted from bones found in passage tombs, some over 5,000 years old. What they expected was a simple story: an indigenous Irish population, genetically stable for millennia. What they found was a sudden, dramatic genetic shift around 2500 BC. The same beaker replacement that happened in England, happening in Ireland too. But here was the strange part. After that initial replacement, Ireland's genetics stabilized, locked in. The island became, genetically speaking, unusually homogeneous. The same lineages, over and over, for thousands of years. Scotland told a different story. Scottish ancient DNA was messier, more layered. You could see wave after wave of influence. Norse raiders from the north, Angles pushing up from the south, Gaels crossing over from Ireland, Picts, the mysterious tattooed people of northern Scotland, leaving a signal that was unlike anything else on the islands. And England was chaos, beautiful, complex, layered genetic chaos. Roman soldiers from Syria and North Africa, Anglo-Saxon settlers from Denmark and Germany, Viking colonizers from Norway, Norman lords from France, each wave leaving its mark. Each group adding another thread to a tapestry that historians had always described as simply English. But then something changed. In 2015, a landmark paper dropped. A team led by researchers at Oxford used a new technique, one that could identify not just what DNA was present, but where specific chunks of DNA came from geographically and when they arrived. They looked at over 2,000 living British and Irish people, and they mapped their genomes against ancient populations across all of Europe. The results were precise, uncomfortably precise. And what they revealed about the relationship between the Irish, the Scottish, and the English was something that politicians, historians, and nationalists had spent centuries trying to argue away. Let's follow one specific finding. The people of Orkney, the remote Scottish islands sitting just off the northern tip of Scotland, came back with a genetic profile unlike anything on the mainland. 30% of their ancestry was Norse, not symbolically Norse, not culturally Norse, genetically Norse. Meaning that at some point, most likely during the Viking Age, enough Scandinavian settlers arrived on those islands to permanently reshape the local gene pool. That was expected. History records Norse settlement in Orkney, but here is the part that wasn't expected. That Norse signal, 30%, was higher than the Norse signal found in many parts of Norway itself today. Orkney, technically Scotland, was more genetically Scandinavian than parts of Scandinavia, and yet, the people of Orkney speak with a Scottish accent. They identify as Scottish. They support Scotland in the rugby. Identity and DNA had completely decoupled, and if that was true in Orkney, where else was it true? Researchers started looking harder, and the answers that came back were deeply unsettling. Because in the English county of Cumbria, Just across the water from Ireland, researchers found a genetic cluster that was almost identical to populations in County Leitrim in northwest Ireland. The border between England and Ireland meant nothing to these genes. In Cornwall, the far southwestern tip of England, the genetics looked more like Brittany in France than like London, 60 miles to the east. In Wales, a separate cluster entirely, genetically distinct from England in ways that the political border barely hints at. This is where the story gets strange, because what was emerging wasn't just a picture of genetic diversity. It was a picture of genetic memory. These clusters had been sitting in these locations, largely unchanged, for over 1,000 years. The Anglo-Saxon invasion, the Norman conquest, the Industrial Revolution, mass urbanization. None of it had fully erased what was already there. The original peoples of these islands, whoever they were, whatever they called themselves, had left a signal so deep in the population that it survived everything history threw at it. But why? Why had the genetics stayed so stable in some places and shifted so dramatically in others? The answer to that question would send researchers down a path they hadn't expected to walk. And it would force a complete rethinking of what these three nations, Ireland, Scotland, England, actually are, not politically, not culturally, but at the most fundamental level of all, at the level of blood. By 2020, the pieces were starting to come together, and they were not forming the picture anyone expected. A massive collaborative project, drawing on universities across Britain, Ireland, Germany, and the United States, began synthesizing everything, every ancient genome, every modern sample, every migration wave. They called it a People of the British Isles study in scope, though it drew on work far beyond any single project. And what emerged from that synthesis was a map, not a political map, not a cultural map, a genetic map. And on that map, England was not one thing. It was at least 6 distinct genetic clusters, each one corresponding to a region. East Anglia looked like Denmark. The south coast looked like northern France. Yorkshire carried strong Norse signals. The southwest was ancient British, barely touched by the Anglo-Saxons at all. Scotland broke into at least 4 clusters: the Highlands, the Lowlands, the Islands. And the border regions, genetically a blend of English and Scottish that political history had never fully acknowledged. Ireland was the strangest of all, because Ireland, despite centuries of invasion, Vikings, Normans, the English plantations, was genetically the most homogeneous of the 3 nations. The invasions had happened. The records confirmed it. But genetically, the invaders had largely disappeared, absorbed, outnumbered, replaced, not by force, but by sheer demographic weight. The Irish population, it seemed, had a remarkable capacity to absorb outside groups and leave almost no trace of them in the gene pool, almost. Because there was one exception, one group of people in one specific part of Ireland who carried a genetic signal so distinct, so unexpected, so completely at odds with everything around them, that when researchers first saw the data, they thought it was an error. They ran the samples again. Same result, they checked for contamination. None. They looked for a historical explanation, and what they found changed everything they thought they knew about these 3 nations. Everything pointed to one answer, one clean, simple answer. But there was one thing no one had checked, one region, one cluster, one genetic signal sitting quietly in the data, overlooked, misread, set aside, waiting. That signal, you thought you knew the story, 3 nations. 3 bloodlines, 3 separate peoples who happened to share a small corner of the North Atlantic. That was the story, but in part 1, we saw the first cracks appear. The DNA didn't follow the borders. The genetics didn't match the history books, and one tiny cluster of people in one corner of Ireland was carrying something in their genes that no one could explain. We left the story at the edge of an answer that the researchers themselves weren't sure they were ready to find. Now, let's go deeper. The year is 2023. A paper is published in the journal Nature. The title is dense, academic. Easy to scroll past if you don't know what you're looking for, but inside that paper is the most complete genetic portrait of the British Isles ever assembled. The team, led by researchers at the University of Oxford, University College London, and the Wellcome Sanger Institute, had spent years pulling together data. Ancient DNA from over 700 archaeological samples, modern DNA from nearly 10,000 living people, carefully selected to have 4 grandparents from the same region. This last detail matters enormously. It means each person's DNA is a window into what that specific location looked like, genetically, at least 2 generations back. Before mass migration, before urbanization shuffled everything together, what they built was a time machine made of chromosomes, and the first thing that time machine showed them was this: the genetic structure of the British Isles is ancient, far more ancient than anyone had modeled. The clusters they found, the distinct genetic populations sitting in specific geographic regions, weren't the product of the last few centuries of history. Many of them dated back to before the Roman invasion. Before the Anglo-Saxons, before the Vikings, some of them stretched back to the Bronze Age, meaning that the people living in certain parts of Ireland, Scotland, and England today are, genetically, closer to people who lived there 3,000 years ago than they are to their nearest geographic neighbors. Think about what that means. 3,000 years of invasion. Migration. Plague, famine, war, colonization, and the genetics held, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough that a scientist in 2023 can look at a DNA sample from a man in Kerry and find echoes of a Bronze Age farmer who never left that coastline. The data gets more specific. In Northern and Western Ireland, Connacht, Ulster, parts of Munster, the ancient farmer DNA from that original Anatolian wave is present at levels not seen anywhere else in the British Isles. Some samples show up to 40% ancestry from those original Neolithic settlers, people who arrived on this island 6,000 years ago and simply never left. The Irish in those regions are carrying the oldest genetic memory on the islands, but Scotland tells a different story. And this is where the 2023 paper gets truly remarkable. The Highlands of Scotland, geographically remote, historically isolated, show a genetic signature that is distinct from both Ireland and England. It is not simply a blend of the two. It has its own character, its own ancient roots. And those roots, when traced back through ancient DNA, connect most strongly not to the Celts of popular imagination, but to a population that was already in Scotland before the Celts arrived, the Picts, the mysterious, tattooed people of northern Scotland who resisted the Romans so effectively that Hadrian built an entire wall just to keep them contained. The people who left behind intricate carved stones, symbols that no one has fully decoded to this day. For centuries, historians debated who the Picts were, where they came from, why they vanished so completely from the historical record after the 9th century. The genetic data suggests they didn't vanish. They just stopped being called Picts. Their DNA is still there. Sitting in the Highland clusters, quiet, persistent, a ghost population hiding in plain sight inside the genomes of modern Scots. Yes, but, and this is where it complicates beautifully, the Pictish signal is not uniform across Scotland. In the lowlands it fades. Anglo-Saxon and Norse ancestry rises. The lowland Scots are genetically closer to northern English populations than they are to their Highland compatriots, which means that Scotland, politically one nation, is genetically at least two. And England, well, England is where it gets truly extraordinary. The 2023 study confirmed something earlier research had hinted at but never quite proven. The Anglo-Saxon migration, one of the most consequential events in English history, was real, substantial, and genetically visible in eastern and central England. Between 30 and 40% of ancestry traces back to migrants from Denmark and northern Germany who arrived between 400 and 700 AD. That is not a trickle. That is a flood. Those migrants remade the gene pool of a significant portion of what is now England, but here is the thing that no one expected. Western England barely moved, in Devon, in Somerset, in Cumbria, in the Welsh marches. The Anglo-Saxon signal drops to almost nothing. The ancient British population, the people who were there before the Saxons, before the Romans, speaking Celtic languages and farming land their families had worked for generations, survived in the West, not because they were protected by geography alone, but because something about the social structure of the Anglo-Saxon migration limited intermarriage. The genetic evidence suggests the incoming Saxon population and the existing British population lived side by side for generations, without fully mixing. Two peoples, one island, parallel lives, and the line between them, drawn in DNA, still exists today. Threck a line roughly from the Severn estuary in the south to the Humber in the north. East of that line, heavily Anglo-Saxon. West of that line, ancient British. This line is not on any political map, but it is written in the genes of millions of people. Now, back to Ireland, and the anomaly, the cluster that stopped researchers cold. In a specific region of northeast Ireland, roughly corresponding to parts of County Antrim and Down, the area closest to Scotland, there is a genetic population that doesn't behave like the rest of Ireland. The rest of Ireland, as we said, is remarkably homogeneous, ancient, stable, but this cluster carries a signal that is distinctly Scottish, specifically lowland Scottish. The same genetic profile as populations just across the narrow North Channel Strait, where Ireland and Scotland are separated by only 12 miles of water. The historical explanation seems obvious at first. The Ulster Plantation, the deliberate settlement of Scottish and English Protestants in Ulster beginning in the early 1600s. Surely that explains it, yes, but when researchers dated the genetic signal, when they looked at the length of the DNA segments to estimate when the mixing occurred, the Scottish ancestry in this cluster was older than the plantation. Significantly older, it predated the 1600s by centuries, which means the genetic connection between northeast Ireland and Scotland was not created by English colonial policy. It was already there, and suddenly, a much older story came into focus. The Dal Riata, a kingdom that existed, if you can call it that. It was more of a cultural and political network across both sides of the North Channel. A kingdom that straddled what we now call the border between Ireland and Scotland between roughly 500 and 800 AD. The people of Dal Riata moved freely across that 12-mile stretch of water. They intermarried. They traded. They built monasteries on both sides. It was from Dal Riata that the Gaelic language spread into Scotland. The people we now call Scots, their very name, their language, their cultural identity, originated with Irish settlers crossing into what was then called Caledonia. The Irish, in a very real sense, created Scotland, and the genetics remember it even now. 1400 years later, the people of northeast Ireland and southwest Scotland share a genetic closeness that reflects that ancient, fluid, borderless world. The border, the one on the map, the one that separates the United Kingdom from the Republic of Ireland, means nothing to these genes. It never did. And here is where the story becomes something more than just science, something more than data. Think about what these findings mean for living people. A man in Belfast who identifies as Protestant, British, Unionist. His family has been in Ulster for 400 years, as far as he knows. His identity is built around being distinct, separate from the Catholic Irish around him. His DNA tells a different story. It says he and the man in the nationalist area, 3 streets away, share a genetic profile so similar it is almost indistinguishable, because both of them, whatever their religion, whatever their politics, whatever flags they fly, are the product of the same ancient population. The same Neolithic farmers, the same Bronze Age herders, the same medieval migrations across a body of water that was never really a border. A woman in Edinburgh who has always thought of herself as Scottish, proudly, fiercely Scottish. Her family from the Highlands, her DNA says her most direct ancient ancestors were not Celts. Were not even Scots in any historical sense. They were a people whose name, Pict, was erased from the map over 1,000 years ago. A people so thoroughly written out of history that most people today couldn't tell you a single thing about them, and yet they are in her, waiting, silent, real. A man in London who is third-generation English. His grandparents came from Yorkshire. He has never thought much about his ancient origins. His DNA carries a signal from a Syrian-born Roman soldier who was stationed at Hadrian's Wall 1,800 years ago. That soldier never went home. His descendants moved south over centuries, mixed, blended, became English, whatever English means, and something of him survived. These are not abstract findings. These are not academic footnotes. These are people, living people, whose sense of who they are, whose entire framework of identity, was built on a story that the DNA gently, quietly, persistently contradicts. Not to erase those identities, not to say they don't matter, but to say, you are older than you think, you are more connected than you think. The borders you believe in, the ones worth fighting for, dying for, hating across, those borders are maybe 2,000 years old, your genes are 6,000 years old. Which one is telling the truth? There is a question that none of the papers quite answer. A question that sits at the edge of all this data, unresolved. Why did these genetic clusters hold? Why, after thousands of years of migration and invasion and plague and famine, why did specific populations in specific corners of these islands remain so distinct? The easy answer is geography, mountains, coastlines, islands within islands, but the geography alone doesn't account for it because in some cases, Orkney, parts of Ulster, the genetic boundary running through England, the persistence of those clusters had nothing to do with physical barriers. The barriers were social, cultural, invisible. People were choosing, consciously or not, to marry within their own community, generation after generation, across centuries, not because of laws, not because of force. Because of something softer and more powerful than either identity, the sense of being from somewhere specific, of belonging to a particular place, a particular people, a particular way of life. That feeling, that deep, wordless attachment to an identity, was strong enough to shape the genetics of millions of people over thousands of years, which means identity is not just a cultural product, it is a biological force. And that question, about what identity really is, where it comes from, and how much power it holds over us, has never been fully answered. The study concluded, the papers were published, the data was archived. But the people whose DNA was mapped, they went home, back to their borders, back to their flags, back to their stories about who they are and where they come from, and somewhere right now, in a laboratory in Oxford or Dublin or Edinburgh, another sample is being processed, another set of ancient bones, pulled from the earth, another voice from 3,000 years ago about to speak. We just haven't heard it yet.